Good evening. In this session, we will have a look at the way economics gets defined by Lyland Robbins by looking at his definition under type B. That's the way the traditional approach is taken up for economics. We had a look at the type A definition given by Adam Smith and Marshall. Now, talking about Lyland Robbins, he looked at economics in a way that he connected the economics to a science of study of human behavior. He said that economics is something to do with the human behavior. So he did not classify or form a group of people who were either related in the generation of wealth or they were the people who were engaged in their livelihood earning just as to procure something which could add to their material welfare. So he tend to disagree with the way Adam Smith looked at economics as a science of wealth. He also disagreed with Marshall, who just kind of covered the every person in the society, but then at the same time, their efforts being put in just to get the material welfare. For Robbins, he said economics is not classificatory in nature, it is analytical in nature. So he tried to examine the human behavior. And when he examined the human behavior, he realized that one thing was common to all, and that commonness was in terms of that the resources are limited in nature and we have unlimited wants. So, resources not only being limited in nature, they could also be put to alternative uses. And therefore, this gave rise to the fact that human being had to make a choice. So, if you have a look at his definition, which he laid down in 1932 in his book Nature and Significance of Economic Science, he talks about the economic aspect of that human behavior. And that economic aspect of human behavior arises just because of the scarcity of resources. The other point that he brought before us is that economics is neutral between ends. He always said that economics has nothing to do with whether something is good or bad. So, whether a final want that we have is noble or ignoble, economics has nothing to do with it. The only fact that arises is that somebody requires something, whether it can be a cigarette or a alcohol, and economics has nothing to do whether the consumption of alcohol or cigarette is good or bad. The fact remains that the person who is asking for that good requires it just because that person wants to satisfy his or her want. So that person who wishes to consume such items will also be facing the problem of whether to buy it or not, just because the scarcity of resources is also going to rise for him. Since the scarcity of resources are also going to rise for him or arise for him, and therefore he will have to make a choice whether to consume both of them together in the same quantity or to kind of forego one of them and to go for the consumption of one. So, economics, as put by Lyland Robbins, is neutral between ends. Then he took economics as to be a human science. Fine. So he said that it is not a social science because when you're talking about social science, you're only dealing with the people who are living in a society. But for him, economics was a human science. Now, human science means that it is even going to study somebody who's living in isolation. And you come across a popular example being quoted that even if a person is staying in a Himalayas, even a person in Himalayas is going to get covered under the study of economics just because that person too would be facing the problem of limited resources. So even if you are staying alone, then also you face this problem, and that resource can be a time resource. So no matter even if a person is a saint or a holy person who is staying in Himalayas in isolation and is absorbed in his this thing prayers and in the meditation, that person too would be facing the problem of how to allocate the time. Then for Robbins, economics is a positive science. So economics is a positive science means it deals with the fact. So economics has is it deals only with the fact, which means that economics is not going to pass a judgment. If I just kind of correlate these 2 points, economics is neutral between ends and economics is a positive science, you'll be able to understand better. Why I say so? Just because positive science means that you are laying down a fact. What is? Fine. So you're just simply stating that this is the way this thing is, or this is what is taking place. So when you're reporting what is factually present, that is positive. So positive science is something which you are stating it the way it is. So the way it is when we are where we in a society, if you have a look, you come across people who are engaged in the consumption of such kind of items which may not be good for them. So, but then the way it is, there are people who are consuming drugs, there are people who are consuming alcohol, there are people who are into wrong habits, but then that's the way it is. So, economics has no right to pass judgment. So, it is something to do with the human behavior because even those people are also going to face this problem of scarcity of resources. Now, moving on to the criticism of Robbins' definition, we come across that it was more scientific and impersonal. It doesn't take into account the normative aspect. So it has nothing to do with the this thing whether a good is bad, whether a good that you're consuming is noble or ignoble. It is not going to pass any kind of value judgment on the wants that are being wanted by the people in a society. And whatever the definition that he has given of the human behavior, it is not necessary that economics is always going to talk about something which has got a social implication. But then criticism comes in that you cannot include everybody in the study of economics just because, as I happen to explain you, a person, a holy person, or a sage living in Himalayas, lost in the meditation, will also face the problem of how to allocate the time. But then we cannot end up covering everyone under the study of economics. So for him, the criticism comes in that the choices that you are making, which are having no social implications, somebody staying far off in Himalayas, that person's activity has no effect on the people who are living in a society. So since his behavior is not going to have a effect on the people who are living in a society, that cannot come under the purview of economics. So if Robbins widened the definition of economics and he said, why are you taking it in terms of wealth, or why are you talking about the people who are engaged in ordinary business of life and who are there to carry on with their livelihood just because to have something which is going to add to their material welfare? Why do you talk about it economics dealing with these two parts only? Economics is something which is talking about a economic aspect of the human behavior. But then economic aspect of human behavior is going to arise for everyone. And that would make the area or scope of economics very wide. And that became a point of criticism of his definition. Now, Robbins, when he speaks about economics being a study of human behavior, just because the resources are limited and they have to fulfill the unlimited wants that we have, he was only concerned with the allocation of resources because how you're going to allocate that scarce resource. But then it is not only the scarcity of the resources or the allocation of resources that has to be done just because the resources are scarce. There are other two problems also that are faced by all the economies. One is the fuller employment, and the second one is the growth of resources. So it was not just enough that you're going to only grapple with this problem of how to allocate your scarce resources. There will be other problems also that would be arising, that whatever resources you have allocated, whether they are being utilized to their fullest or not. And then there would also be that if you are even utilizing your resources to the fullest, will you not wish to grow further ahead? So that's how you see the economies making an effort to allocate their scarce resources, trying to see to it that they get fully employed or fully utilized, and there is no underutilization of them. But at the same time, economies you get to see progress, right? So that's how you get to see that economies keep on moving ahead. So how economies keep on moving ahead? Just because they not only concern themselves only with the allocation of resources, they also look at the fuller employment and the growth of resources. Then another criticism that comes in for Robbins' definition is that he dealt only with the problem of scarcity. So he neglected the problem of surplus. It is not that the economies only face the problem of scarcity, but there are times when you have something in abundance and then also there is a problem. And that problem of surplus, if I take up an example in terms of our country, you get to see that yes, of course, there are times when the bumper crop takes place and that bumper production of food grain results in the rotting of that food grain just because of the lack of the warehouses to store them. So scarcity of warehouses there, you do not have too much of them in number, but then at the same time, the food grains are in surplus. So this surplus is creating a problem of how and where to store them. So this problem of surplus was missed out by Robbins. So it's not only the problem of surplus which is related only to the food grains. There are other areas also where at times you get to see that the surplus poses a problem. You do not understand how to utilize that surplus just because you do not have other infrastructure to take care of that surplus.